Let's say Trump was in a really big bind, that his rhetoric had boxed him into a corner. He wanted to bring an end to this conflict, but if he didn't strike Iran, then he would be perceived as weak.
You've joined us today for a deep dive, and it's really happening at a pivotal moment.
It really is. Not just in the world, geopolitically speaking, but, well, right here with the source material we're looking at.
Exactly. We are about to unpack a pretty complex narrative, one that really pushes back against the usual way of thinking about these things.
Mm-hmm. It forces you, really, to look beyond the headlines, way beyond.
Right. So our mission today, it's about giving you that shortcut, to being genuinely informed on a critical global event. Indeed.
Today we're diving deep into the intricate layers of a really controversial analysis. We're talking about the 2025 U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict.
The period our source, this notable geopolitical commentator, actually calls the 12-day war.
That's the one. And we'll be digging into this central tension in his analysis. It's a real paradox.
How a U.S. military strike against Iran could be seen as, two completely opposite things at the same time.
Exactly. On one hand, an unequivocally illegal war crime, just flat out.
On the other.
And paradoxically, a very carefully orchestrated act of political theater, designed specifically, believe it or not, to de-escalate a conflict that was spiraling totally out of control.
It's a perspective that really demands you, suspend your assumptions. Consider a totally unconventional take.
Absolutely. We're going to try and uncover the hidden desperation that, according to this viewpoint, drove both Israel and Iran to want a ceasefire.
Peeling back that public bravado, right, to see the immense pressure they were under internally.
Mm-hmm. And we'll touch on some, frankly, astonishing allegations about international complicity. Mm-hmm. We're talking intelligence sharing involving the IAEA.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And we'll even get into the high stakes that led our source, this commentator, to demand a more disciplined discussion from his own audience.
A demand that, as you'll hear, really shaped the future of his whole platform.
And look, this deep dive, it isn't just about, listing facts. Mm-hmm. It's about understanding the why. Why did these powerful nations act the way they did?
The surprising motivations, often uncomfortable ones, lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. And the profound implications all of this has for shaping our world. You'll find, I think, that the stated goals and the real drivers behind these events, sometimes they're worlds apart.
And as we navigate this challenging territory, we really invite you, our listener, to engage with that same kind of rigor, the same critical thinking our source is championing.
Get ready for some serious, moments, possibly, because we are going deep. Right into the heart of a conflict whose echoes are still being felt.
Okay, so before we fully immerse ourselves in the geopolitical nitty-gritty of this 12-day war, we need to talk about something else first, something fundamental that's been brewing with our source.
Yes, the context behind the analysis itself.
Exactly. It directly impacts how he views and, conducts these serious geopolitical discussions. You see, he recently announced a pretty significant transformation for his own show, a shift born out of, frankly, deep-seated frustration.
That's right. He's actually ending its previous format entirely, taking a hiatus for all of July.
A whole month off.
A whole month. And then returning in August with a much more streamlined approach. Just a single weekly episode, airing only on Wednesdays.
That's a huge change, considering his show often had multiple, really long episodes each week.
It is. And, he did express immense gratitude for his audience. He acknowledged the previous format served its purpose. Mm-hmm. But the dominant feeling in his announcement, it was this clear, palpable frustration.
Palpable is the word.
Yeah.
He got into some really emotional territory, expressed deep concern that a lot of the questions he was getting weren't just, undisciplined.
Which was his term for it.
Right. But seemed, in his view, deliberately designed to provoke, to just generate anger.
Mm-hmm. He felt it was derailing the conversation.
He was pretty blunt about it. He said, and this is a direct quote, that defeats the purpose of the show. You could almost feel his exasperation when he declared, "I'm not here to play fic games."
He really hammered that point home, emphasized the gravity of the work he's doing. He explained, his show isn't just some platform for entertainment or trivial debate.
No.
He stated it very forcefully. This is a serious show. There's people dying around the world, life and death issues, and I just don't need B.
Wow. So he was just fed up.
Completely fed up with what he saw as these deliberate attempts to derail serious conversations, with comments that were unproductive, or just plain hostile. And this isn't, just a casual remark. It's a strong declaration about the seriousness of the topics he covers.
And his commitment to, responsible discourse.
Exactly. He's looking for genuine engagement with these really critical global issues, not just noise.
Yeah. And his vision for the future of his show, it's crystal clear. Weed out the B and keep the good as in.
Direct, again.
Very. He wants to focus entirely on providing what he calls a legitimate geopolitical service, a place where serious, well-thought-out questions can be asked and answered without all the distraction and provocation.
He did acknowledge, didn't he, that entertainment and humor have their place.
He did. But the core purpose, he insists, remains profoundly serious. He gets that for many people, these aren't just academic discussions. They connect to real-world consequences, real lives.
And this whole meta-commentary, about his own show changing, it's crucial, actually, because it frames the very deep dive we're about to take into the 12-day war.
How so?
So this complex analysis of the Iran-Israel conflict that we're about to lay out, it's precisely the kind of serious, disciplined geopolitical discussion he's advocating for.
I see. It's an example of what he wants more of.
Exactly. It's not for, superficial engagement or people looking for easy answers. It's for those genuinely seeking a deeper understanding. People willing to grapple with uncomfortable truths and, frankly, challenging perspectives.
And that level of rigorous engagement is what he expects from his audience now.
And it's what we aim to deliver to you, our listeners, today.
Okay, let's unpack this central paradox then, because this is where our sources analysis really challenges the conventional thinking, demands we look beyond the surface of what was reported about the U.S. intervention in Iran.
Right. We have to start with his initial uncompromising judgment. The U.S. action was, in his analysis, unequivocally illegal.
No ifs, ands, or buts.
He makes absolutely no bones about it, states it flatly. A blatant violation of both international agreements and the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, break that down. International agreements first.
Well, he's likely referring to international law, like the UN Charter, which, generally prohibits using force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, unless it's clear self-defense or, crucially, authorized by a UN Security Council resolution, neither of which applied here, in his view.
And the U.S. Constitution side?
Domestically, he points right to the Constitution. The power to declare war rests with Congress, not solely with the president.
Which didn't happen here.
No. So he directly accuses the U.S. president of having, and this is another direct quote, aligned himself with the pantheon of war criminals for this unlawful action against Iran.
Wow. Pantheon of war criminals. That's strong language.
Extremely. He stresses there was no legitimacy, no justification under international law, and no permission under the Constitution. It sets this incredibly stark, critical tone right from the beginning, frames the act as a grave breach of established legal norms.
That is a powerful condemnation, calling a U.S. presidential action a war crime. But here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Where we're told to think out of the box.
Exactly. Because our source introduces this counter-narrative.
Yeah.
Suggesting that this seemingly illegal act was, in fact, something else entirely. A carefully calculated strategic move. A grand act of political theater.
Okay, political theater. Why? What was the thinking behind it, according to him?
He argues that Trump found himself, quote, boxed into a corner by his own rhetoric, essentially, his whole peace through strength mantra.
Right, he'd promised a tough response to Iran.
Consistently. A demonstration of American resolve was expected, politically. But, and this is the critical part, he needed a demonstration of American will that would satisfy his base, satisfy allies, without triggering what could have been a truly cataclysmic regional conflict.
A full-scale war, which nobody, especially Trump, really wanted.
Precisely. Which leads us to this idea of the grand act of political theater, a truly audacious plan, if this analysis is correct.
So how did this theater play out? What were the specifics?
Okay, so the targets chosen for the U.S. strikes, they were highly significant, at least in name. 3 specific nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, all central to Iran's nuclear program.
Big names, symbolic targets.
Very. But here's the crucial part of the argument. The claim is that these were identified and understood by those orchestrating this as empty sites, or at least facilities where the critical components had already been moved out.
So hitting the building, but maybe not the important stuff inside.
That's the idea. The show of force, though, was undeniably impressive, designed for maximum public impact. You had 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. These are among the most advanced, most visually striking aircraft the U.S. has.
Right, the flying wings.
Exactly. Reportedly dropping 14 massive ordnance penetrators. These are huge, deep penetrating bombs designed to destroy hardened, buried targets. And they fired 34 cruise missiles as well. It was a spectacle of military might. Intentionally so.
A spectacle, but with a calculated outcome.
That's the core claim. The calculated outcome, according to this analysis, was that the strikes killed nobody, blew up already empty sites, or didn't do a damn thing.
Which directly contradicts what Trump was saying publicly.
Directly. Trump claimed at the time to have completely and fully obliterated Iran's nuclear program. This analysis suggests a deliberate gap between the public statements and the operational reality.
A carefully managed illusion.
Precisely. Designed to achieve a specific political outcome. Project Overwhelming Strength satisfied the need for action, but without causing the actual catastrophic escalation that hitting active critical sites would have caused. The whole point was the appearance of a devastating strike, not necessarily the reality of one that would ignite a wider war.
Okay, so the U.S. strikes were theater. What about Iran's response? Was that part of the script too, in this view?
That's the argument. It was anticipated, even orchestrated perhaps, that Iran would retaliate, but crucially, on an empty U.S. base.
An empty base? How does that work?
Well, the specific example cited is Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. It's a major U.S. facility in the region. The idea is that a strike there would serve as a necessary face-saving gesture for Iran.
Allowing them to claim they'd struck back forcefully.
Exactly, without actually causing U.S. casualties or inviting a much heavier American counter-response. And critically, the claim is the U.S. was warned in advance about this impending, largely symbolic strike.
Warned in advance, so they knew it was coming.
Reportedly, yes. And as a result, no U.S. casualties occurred at the base. Adding to this narrative, Qatar later reported intercepting all but one missile. And that one missile conveniently landed in a deserted area.
Convenient indeed.
It reinforces this narrative of a controlled exchange.
Yeah.
Both sides get to claim victory in their own way. Trump for hitting Iran hard, Iran for responding forcefully, but without any actual uncontrolled escalation or significant bloodshed.
And then right after this, this carefully managed exchange.
Almost immediately, Trump facilitated a ceasefire.
So if you connect all those dots, the argument is that this illegal act of war, this war crime, it actually became a kind of liberating moment for Trump.
Paradoxically, yes. It gave him a politically viable way to, quote, extricate himself without appearing weak from a conflict he desperately didn't want to escalate into a full-blown war. But he needed a strong-looking exit.
He fulfilled the peace through strength promise.
Without the cataclysmic consequences. He got the optics he needed.
Okay, so the concluding thought here, it's pretty profound.
Yeah.
And unsettling.
It really is.
Yeah.
While undeniably an illegal attack, from a strict legal perspective, the argument goes that if the ceasefire holds, it's a good thing. It necessitates this broader perspective beyond just simple legal definitions.
Forcing us to consider the strategic utility of such an action in calming down a volatile situation.
Exactly. It compels you to grapple with this really uncomfortable idea. Could a war crime, in this specific manipulated context, be seen simultaneously as a politically effective, albeit morally dubious, path towards peace?
It makes you question what victory or de-escalation even means in modern geopolitics, where optics and political maneuvering might actually override traditional battlefield results.
It's a deeply challenging perspective.
Okay, moving beyond the U.S. action itself, let's shift focus to the actual combatants, Israel and Iran, because a really surprising reality seems to have emerged from this 12-day war.
Yes, surprising because it cuts against the grain of their public postures.
Right. Both Israel and Iran, despite all the tough talk, the bravado, the long-standing animosity, they were, according to our source, desperately seeking an end to the fighting.
Desperately is the key word here. Israel in particular wasn't just seeking a ceasefire, they were reportedly begging for one.
Begging. That really challenges the narrative of an unstoppable Israeli military machine.
It absolutely does, with Prime Minister Netanyahu apparently making repeated phone calls to Trump to try and broker an end to it.
So why? Why was Israel perceived as so powerful, supposedly begging for peace after just 12 days? What were the reasons?
Well, this is a critical point that really goes against that perception of Israeli military invincibility and sort of unlimited endurance. The details provided suggest severe operational strain on their most valuable assets.
Like their Air Force.
Exactly. After 12 days of continuous combat operations, their Air Force was apparently pushed to the breaking point. We're talking about the F-35 specifically.
Yeah.
Often touted as this game-changing, super advanced fighter jet.
Right, the stealth fighter.
But it was described here as a fickle beast at best, meaning, yes, it's highly sophisticated, but also incredibly demanding to maintain, especially under combat conditions.
So what does fickle beast mean in practical terms?
It means its operational sortie capability. It's basically the number of effective missions an aircraft can fly in a certain time was rapidly dropping off the scale.
Not just a slight dip then.
No. This suggests a dramatic decrease in their ability to actually get these planes in the air and keep them effective. Sustained combat quickly wears down sensitive things like stealth coatings, complex electronics, engines.
And it wasn't just the F-35s.
No, apparently similar issues were plaguing their older, but still critical, workhorse jets, the F-16s and F-15s. They were reaching a point where they desperately needed a maintenance pause.
Pause their operational tempo just couldn't afford in the middle of a fight.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You simply cannot fly these high-tech, high-performance aircraft relentlessly without significant, costly downtime for repairs, servicing, and replacing parts. The intensity of the 12 days was just too much.
That's a huge drain on their capability. And it wasn't just their planes struggling, was it? What about their missile defenses, the Iron Dome and systems like that?
Another critical area under immense pressure. Israel's multi-layered ballistic missile intercept capacity was being diminished.
Meaning they were running out of interceptors.
Essentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Think about systems like Iron Dome, David's Sling, the Arrow system. They rely on these expensive interceptor missiles. When you're under constant barrage, you expend those interceptors very rapidly.
And resupply takes time.
And it's expensive. Resupply or domestic production just couldn't keep pace with the rate of incoming threats Iran was throwing at them. And compounding this problem.
Iran was getting better.
That's the claim. Iran was rapidly solving the problem and employing newer missiles that were of great accuracy. These were just, random rockets flying over. The source suggests Iran was deploying more precise ballistic missiles capable of hitting critical infrastructure, military bases, inflicting significant harm to Israel.
So, Israel was facing dwindling air power, dwindling missile defense, and increasingly accurate Iranian missiles.
Exactly. It all culminated in a situation where Netanyahu, despite whatever aggressive public statements he was making, apparently recognized the reality. He needed to pull the plug on the operation. He had to end it because his military was reaching a critical breaking point. The cost was becoming unsustainable.
Okay, that explains Israel's desperation. But what about Iran? Their quick agreement to the ceasefire is equally telling, isn't it? Especially considering, as you mentioned, they had supposedly prepared for a conflict that could last up to 2 years.
Right, and they reportedly threatened to send tens of thousands of missiles into Israel. That's a huge gap between their pre-war rhetoric and their post-war actions.
It really highlights a potential miscalculation on their part, doesn't it, about the actual realities of sustained modern warfare?
It absolutely does. It starkly illustrates that old saying, war is hell, and things that you conceive of in peacetime don't necessarily play out in time of war.
So, what was the miscalculation? Did they overestimate their own defenses?
It seems so. Prior to the conflict, there was this widespread belief, even among some Western analysts, that Iranians are invincible.
Yeah.
Because of their deep underground facilities, their missile capabilities.
And the idea that their air defenses were formidable.
Yes. The belief that advanced U.S. bombers, like the B-2s, will never get into Iranian airspace because of their layered air defense systems. That perception, our source argues, proved to be very far from the reality once the shooting actually started.
So what was the reality then? In the air over Iran, how did those vaunted air defenses actually perform against the U.S. and Israeli attacks? What happened to that supposed invincibility?
The reality, as described by our source, was, brutal and unexpected for Iran. Those B-2s, designed specifically for stealth and penetrating exactly these kinds of advanced air defenses. They penetrated Iranian airspace like a hot knife through butter.
Lived up to their reputation then.
Completely. And furthermore, Israel, contrary to some initial assessments that maybe downplayed their ability to really hurt Iran's integrated air defense system, Israel heavily denigrated Iran's air defense on day one.
Denigrated meaning disabled, destroyed.
Yes. Effectively tripled key Iranian radar sites, command and control centers, surface-to-air missile batteries, basically punching holes in their defensive network, creating pathways for their own aircraft to operate.
And this allowed Israel
to enjoy relative free reign of the sky. Even going so far, according to the source, as drilling holes over Tehran and dropping bombs.
Drilling holes over Tehran, that phrase, it suggests an incredible level of air superiority. Like they could just pick their targets almost at will, deep inside Iran.
That's the implication. Conducting precision strikes deep within Iranian territory, hitting specific facilities, infrastructure, with relative impunity. Something previously thought almost impossible against Iran's defenses.
That must have been devastating, not just physically, but psychologically for Iran. So what was the human and infrastructural cost that ultimately drove them to seek peace so quickly, despite all their long-term preparations and threats?
The costs were indeed severe, and apparently far exceeded whatever their pre-war calculations might have been. Our source details some grim figures. Over 600 Iranian civilians are dead, possibly many more if you include non-civilians. Thousands wounded.
And infrastructure.
Yes, important infrastructure is being destroyed. This could include factories, power plants, energy infrastructure, transportation hubs, the very things a modern economy relies on. This level of damage, combined with the human toll, it meant Iran had reached the point where they didn't want to suffer any more losses. Now, there are still unknowns, right? Questions remain about Iran's remaining supply of sophisticated missiles, the full extent of the damage to their ballistic missile inventory.
Fog of war.
Exactly. But the conclusion drawn by our source is clear. Iran didn't make a mistake suing for peace. I think it was the right call. The reality of sustained conventional warfare against a technologically superior air force was simply far more damaging than they had anticipated. It forced them to, well, swallow their pride and accept the ceasefire.
So it really was a case of mutual exhaustion then, a kind of grim stalemate where neither side could realistically keep fighting without facing truly unacceptable consequences?
Pretty much. As our source put it quite vividly, both sides were sort of punched drunk and needed to get this war to come to an end.
Punched drunk, that's a state.
Yeah.
And for Trump, stepping in to mediate this ceasefire, it wasn't just about regional stability, was it? It tied back into his own political ambitions.
Absolutely. Our source links it fundamentally to Trump's Nobel Peace Prize bid. Remember, he had, apparently quite deliberately, named it the 12-Day War.
Drawing a parallel to Israel's famous Six-Day War in '67.
Exactly. A legendary Israeli military victory.
Mm-hmm.
By ending this conflict quickly, Trump could then declare he was the man who brought an end to the war that was going to end all war, positioning himself as this great global peacemaker.
And he didn't need Netanyahu or anyone else prolonging the fight and potentially exposing the theater aspect.
Precisely. He didn't need anyone to screw this up for him, as the source put it, not when his own political narrative was on the line.
How fragile is this peace, given the history?
That's the crucial caveat. Our source points out Israel has a history of violating ceasefires when it serves their strategic interests. And apparently there were already reports, even shortly after the ceasefire was agreed, of Israel playing games. Things like aircraft still flying over Iranian airspace.
Probing, testing, keeping the pressure on.
Could be any of those. It suggests that while both sides desperately needed that pause, and Trump needed his political win, the underlying tensions, the strategic maneuvering, that's all still very much alive.
Yeah.
The ceasefire might just be a temporary reprieve, not a definitive end to the hostility.
Okay, this deep dive just keeps getting deeper, doesn't it? Peeling back more and more layers of geopolitical intrigue. Let's fit into one of the most, frankly, shocking and controversial allegations presented by our source.
Yes. The unseen hand, potentially. The alleged complicity of the IAEA in all this.
This isn't just about, routine intelligence sharing between nations. This is a direct accusation against an international body that's supposed to be completely neutral.
It is. And the direct allegation made, which our source emphasizes is based on his own intelligence contacts, is that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, inspectors have been thoroughly infiltrated by the Israelis.
Infiltrated, meaning?
Meaning that key personnel within the IAEA, or perhaps critical channels of information flow, are allegedly compromised, feeding sensitive data directly to a specific national intelligence agency, in this case, Israel's.
Does the source offer any specifics to back up such a huge claim?
He does provide some alleged evidence. He points specifically to the IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi. The claim is that Grossi regularly meets with the Israeli ambassador in Vienna.
Okay, diplomats meet. That doesn't necessarily mean infiltration.
True, but here's the kicker. This ambassador reportedly doesn't come to these meetings alone. He allegedly brings delegations from Israeli military intelligence dealing with Iran and nuclear issues.
Whoa! Military intelligence officials sitting in on meetings between the head of the IAEA and an ambassador.
That's the picture being painted. Routine, direct access to the very highest levels of the IAEA for Israeli intelligence operatives, focused specifically on Iran's nuclear program.
If that's true, it paints a picture of a direct and frankly alarming intelligence pipeline, turning this neutral international watchdog into a potential conduit for one nation's strategic interests.
Exactly. The implication is that sensitive, highly classified information about Iran's nuclear program stuff gathered by international inspectors under the guise of verification.
Like layouts of facilities, types of centrifuges, locations of materials.
All of that. Specific details of the Iranian enrichment facilities are shared with the Israelis, according to this allegation.
And the source connects this directly to the conflict.
Directly. He alleges that much of that data was used by the Israelis to target Iranian nuclear infrastructure during the conflict. And even more specifically, he claims the target aim points for those U.S. strikes on Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo, the ones we discussed as being potentially empty sites, those aim points were heavily informed by intelligence received by the IAEA.
So the argument is a direct, active link. Alleged infiltration leads to intelligence sharing, which then directly informs actual military operations by the U.S. and Israel.
That's the claim. It implies the IAEA's inspections weren't just for monitoring compliance, but were effectively being used for targeting purposes by one side in the conflict.
That is truly an explosive claim. It doesn't just challenge the neutrality of a critical international body, but if it were ever proven true, it would fundamentally undermine the entire global non-proliferation effort, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Trust is paramount in that regime.
So how did Iran react? Did they respond to these specific allegations, or perhaps just to how they perceived the IAEA acted during the conflict itself?
Iran's response, as reported, was pretty strong and immediate. Their parliament moved quickly to approve a bill that would suspend cooperation with the UN nuclear watchdog in certain key areas.
Pulling back from cooperation, why?
They directly accused the IAEA of putting its international credibility up for sale, primarily because the IAEA refused to condemn the attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. This refusal was seen by Iran as, well, effectively signaling that the IAEA wasn't an impartial arbiter in this situation.
So Iran felt the IAEA was biased against them.
That seems to be their conclusion. And this action, suspending cooperation with the very body meant to ensure nuclear safety and compliance. It has profound, far-reaching implications.
For international oversight, for trust.
For the entire non-proliferation regime. If the body meant to verify compliance is perceived by a key member state as being compromised, or worse, actively facilitating attacks, it just shatters the foundation of global efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. It encourages states to be less transparent, not more.
It really raises a huge question about the integrity of these international institutions, especially when they get caught in the middle of high-stakes conflicts. Can they truly remain neutral?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Okay, let's now try to explore the lasting echoes of this 12-day war, the enduring questions it leaves behind. Starting with those starkly conflicting narratives about the actual damage from the U.S. strikes, it seems like everyone had a different story.
Oh, completely different stories. On one side, you had President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu making these incredibly bold claims right after the conflict ended.
Painting a picture of total victory, right?
Absolutely. Decisive, overwhelming victory. Permanent disarmament, almost. Trump claimed Iran's nuclear program was completely and fully obliterated, said it would never rebuild.
Netanyahu
went even further, stated Israel had brought to ruin Iran's nuclear program, definitively removed the threat of nuclear annihilation, called the war a historic victory that will stand for generations. These were huge statements designed for maximum impact.
projecting absolute success, reassuring their domestic audiences.
Exactly. But then, almost immediately, a very different story started to emerge from within the U.S. intelligence community itself.
Directly challenging those official White House and Israeli declarations, it sounds like intense informational warfare, where the truth itself became a battleground.
That's a good way to put it. You had a defense intelligence agency, the DIA report surface, and it directly contradicted those triumphant statements, presented a much more nuanced, much less dramatic picture.
What did the DIA report find?
It found that Iran's program was set back only a few months. Critically, it noted that highly enriched uranium moved prior to the strikes and survived, and that the centrifuges, the machines used for enrichment, were largely left intact.
Which directly supports that political theater theory, doesn't it? Hitting buildings, not the crucial stuff.
It aligns very neatly with that interpretation, yes. Now, the White House, predictably, pushed back hard against this DIA assessment, called it flat out wrong, an attempt to demean President Trump.
Highlighting the political sensitivity when intelligence contradicts the desired public narrative.
Always. Then you had other experts, both American and Israeli officials or analysts, suggesting a setback of maybe roughly 2 years, which, okay, that's more significant than just a few months, but it's still vastly different from completely obliterated.
Worlds apart from obliterated. And Iran's side of the story.
Iran, for its part, quickly started claiming that arrangements were already being made to restore the bombed sites, prevent interruptions to their program, essentially showing defiance and signaling their intent to recover rapidly.
So these wildly divergent narratives, it means understanding the true outcome of those strikes is almost impossible. It just depends on who you believe.
It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Each narrative clearly has its own political agenda driving it. You have to weigh the source, the potential bias, the context. It's a minefield.
Beyond the infrastructure damage, which is clearly contested, what about the human cost? We touched on the civilian deaths, but were there other dimensions to the casualties, particularly these allegations of targeted killing?
Yes, the casualty figures themselves are grim. As we mentioned, sources point to over 974 people killed in Iran overall. Iran's health ministry specifically confirmed 610 civilian deaths from Israeli strikes, highlighting the impact on non-combatants. Israel reported 28 killed on their side, significantly lower, but still tragic.
But then there are these reports of very specific targeted killings, suggesting a different kind of operation was happening alongside the bombing raids.
Exactly. It suggests a deeper level of intelligence gathering and pre-planning for specific assassinations. Reports surfaced, for example, of 7 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard being killed in one particular Israeli strike, including 2 generals.
Taking out command structure.
That would be the goal. Disrupting military operations, decapitating leadership, and even more disturbing, perhaps, were claims reportedly made by Israel's ambassador to France.
What were those?
That at least 14 Iranian physicists and nuclear engineers were killed during the conflict, and the specific mention, by some sources, of Mohammad Reza Siddiqui Saber.
Who was he?
A sanctioned Iranian nuclear scientist, reportedly linked to explosives-related projects and the development of nuclear explosive devices. The claim is he was killed in an Israeli strike.
So targeting key scientific personnel involved in the nuclear program.
If true, yes. It paints a picture of a conflict that wasn't just about air-to-ground strikes on facilities, but potentially included a covert assassination campaign running in parallel, aimed at eliminating irreplaceable human expertise. It adds another layer of complexity to what was happening.
It's fascinating and also disturbing how these intense military actions then ripple outwards, affecting the broader geopolitical landscape, influencing alliances, shifting long-standing dynamics. Let's talk first about the U.S.-Israel dynamic, especially with the U.S. intervening so directly here. Did this change anything?
Well, our source maintains a pretty consistent view on this. The U.S. is clearly the bigger partner in the relationship, and ultimately probably calling the shots on the major strategic decisions.
Even if Israel seems to be pushing for action.
Yes. While Israel remains a very strong influence, and our source even connects that old 7 countries in 5 years policy idea.
The neoconservative plan to reshape the Middle East after Iraq.
Right. He sees that as a byproduct of joint Israeli-U.S. collaboration. But at the end of the day, the ultimate decisions, especially on something as big as direct U.S. military intervention against Iran, are made in Washington, D.C., not Tel Aviv.
So U.S. control remains paramount, even if the influence is strong.
That's the perspective. Even if Israel appears to be driving the agenda or provoking conflict, the U.S. retains the final say on the escalation ladder and the overall strategy. Washington makes the call.
Okay, what about Russia's role, or lack thereof? One might have expected a stronger reaction from Moscow, given their increasingly close relationship with Iran, but we saw a pretty muted response during the 12-day war. Why was that, according to this analysis?
It was notably muted, wasn't it? Russia stated it was ready to help settle things, but explicitly said it would not act as a mediator.
Almost hands-off.
Seemingly. And this passive stance is explained by a calculated decision made by Iran before the conflict. They apparently chose not to sign formal military clauses with either Russia or China, despite the potential benefits.
Why would they avoid that? Seems counterintuitive if you expect conflict.
The reasoning, according to our source, was Iran's fear of entangling alliances. They worried it would compromise their national sovereignty and operational freedom, specifically with Russia.
What was the specific fear regarding Russia?
It's rooted in Vladimir Putin's view of Israel. Putin reportedly sees Israel as, quote, an extension of Russia.
An extension of Russia because of the large Russian-speaking population.
Exactly, all the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. This creates a unique, almost paternalistic view from Moscow towards Israel. So Iran feared that if they had a formal military alliance with Russia, Moscow would inevitably interfere and likely put the brakes on any significant Iranian action against Israel.
Protecting their extension.
That's the idea. So Iran preferred to retain full national security autonomy, make its own decisions, even if that meant foregoing powerful Russian military backing during this specific crisis.
And shifting to another tragic, ongoing issue, the situation in Gaza. How does our source connect that humanitarian catastrophe to this broader regional dynamic, particularly the actions, or maybe inactions, of other Arab nations?
The analysis here is quite critical, unsparing, really. The argument made is that the complicity and betrayal of certain Middle Eastern countries in the region has actually most fueled what the source terms the genocide in Gaza.
Complicity and betrayal. Who is he referring to?
Primarily Arab states that have normalized relations with Israel or who tacitly cooperate with Israel, often driven by their own economic or security interests, even while the Palestinian issue remains unresolved.
Prioritizing national interests over pan-Arab solidarity.
That's the core argument. The Palestinians in this view have been abandoned by the Arabs consistently. Our source points to this historical pattern where Arab nations, despite strong rhetoric supporting the Palestinians, often end up prioritizing their own deals and stability over collective action. This enables Israel, the argument goes, to effectively divide and conquer the region.
And this lack of unified regional support
Directly contributes, in this analysis, to the devastating situation in Gaza. It leaves the Palestinians isolated, vulnerable, and without effective regional backing to counter Israeli actions.
Finally, let's talk about the nature of modern warfare itself. This conflict, with its weird mix of official strikes, alleged assassinations, the whole political theater angle. It raises fundamental questions. Our source has a very strong take on this, doesn't he? Almost philosophical stance.
He does. He's quite dismissive of certain modern trends. He calls things like infiltration, assassination, and covert operation mere tricks.
Tricks, not effective tools of statecraft.
Not in his view, not for winning wars. He firmly believes that wars are won with fundamentals, with conventional military forces doing things conventionally.
What does he mean by fundamentals in this context?
He uses a really vivid analogy.
Yeah.
A football team. The team that consistently practices the basics, blocking, tackling, pass protection, the fundamentals, will ultimately beat the team that only practices flea flickers or other trick plays.
So covert ops, assassinations, those are the trick plays.
That's how he sees them. They can harass an opponent, sure. They can inconvenience them, cause disruptions, maybe even achieve short-term political gains, like he argues happened with a political theater in the 12-Day War, achieving de-escalation. But they don't, in his view, fundamentally win the war.
Real victory requires
Applying overwhelming conventional force, achieving strategic objectives through traditional military means, taking and holding ground, destroying enemy capacity. He suggests that the modern focus on these tricks, these covert actions, often distracts from the true, harder work of building and deploying decisive, conventional military power. It's a very traditionalist view of warfare, in a way.
Wow, we have covered a lot of ground today. We've truly peeled back layers, haven't we? Moving from that deep personal frustration, fueling a call for serious analysis.
Right through that strategic paradox, an illegal act potentially serving as a de-escalation tactic.
To the desperate conditions, the mutual exhaustion that ultimately brought both Israel and Iran to agree to a ceasefire.
We've explored those shadowy, really shocking allegations of intelligence sharing involving the IAEA.
And examined the fragmented, often contradictory realities of the conflict's aftermath. The damage assessments, the human cost, the geopolitical ripples across the Middle East.
And the ability, really, to hold these contradictory ideas in your mind, at the same time war crime and strategic genius. A show of strength born from desperation that seems key, doesn't it, to truly understanding the complex forces playing out on the global stage.
It's about recognizing that sometimes, maybe often, the stated objectives and the real motivations of nations are very, very different.
Absolutely. And that outcomes are often this complex interplay of public narrative, political theater, and gritty, behind-the-scenes maneuvering and desperation.
So what does this all mean for us? For you, the informed observer trying to make sense of global events? Given that this major international conflict seemingly ended, or at least paused, through this bizarre combination of illegal strikes, calculated political theater, and mutual exhaustion, what does it suggest about the evolving nature of warfare and diplomacy itself?
Yeah, are these trick plays, this political theater, are they becoming the new fundamentals? The go-to tools for de-escalating, or maybe even winning, conflicts in this modern era?
And perhaps more fundamentally for the future.
Yeah.
What are the long-term consequences when international law starts to look less like an absolute boundary and more like just another flexible tool, something to be strategically manipulated for political gain?
It leaves us with a really lingering question, doesn't it? About the true cost of peace when it's achieved through such unconventional, even illegal means. And what kind of precedents does that set for the future conflicts that are inevitably coming?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.